welcome to episode 4 of PJ in PJs. I am Pastor Jared, and we are walking through the book of 1 Peter. We're in chapter 1. To give a little context, we're going to start in verse 7, and we will look at verse 8 for the remainder of that time. 1 Peter 1:7 says this, and again I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible, but I have in parallel with that the Greek New Testament. This is based off of Nestle Aland's 27th edition, and over here we have the New Revised Standard Version, which surprisingly has become a favorite of mine as we've been studying through the book of 1 Peter. So verse 7 says, "So that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." We're reminded that the praise and glory and honor is directed to God, and God is the main subject of these few passages, these first 8 passages, or first 7 passages, verses. But then we're going to switch over to a new subject, and that is Jesus Christ. So verse 8 is going to cover the Christian's responses, or how a Christian should respond during the fiery trials of sanctification. There are 3 exceptional responses that Christians have during these fiery trials. And if we look at the subject as Jesus Christ, we see that the reason that we have these responses is because of Jesus Christ himself, or at least the hope of the revelation of Jesus Christ when he appears and we see him face to face. Starting in verse 8, "And though you have not seen him, you love him, and though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory." So what are these 3 responses that Christians should have? Well, the first one is that we love him, and the him is in reference again to Jesus. The second is that we believe in him. And the third is that we rejoice. We rejoice. And all of those, again, are connected specifically to Jesus Christ. Somehow I opened up my tools. I didn't mean to do that. All right, so let's take a look here at the parallels that are being formed, which is really important because they're 2 parallels, but they're slightly different from each other. And then we'll look at the rest of the text here. So as you can see over here in Microsoft Word, I have this typed out to show the parallels between these 2. So here are the first 2 parallels. "Even though we have never met him, and even though we do not see him." And the idea is we don't see him in the midst of our trials. Those are parallel thoughts. And then these 3 are also parallel to each other. We love Jesus, we believe in Jesus, and we rejoice in Jesus. We love Jesus even though we have never met him, and even though we do not see him in the midst of our trials, we believe in Jesus and we rejoice in Jesus. So those are the parallels that we're looking at here. Let's take a look at this first one. And this first one will give us a reason, or at least the reason that I think is that we are exceptional in our responses to trials. So the first one, "And though you have not seen him," this is a present, continuous idea. And it really goes back to like an imperfect verbal aspect. So what that means is that up to this point, we have never actually seen Jesus face to face. And it is see in a literal sense. Horao is the Greek word that we're looking at here. And this Greek word means to see with your eyes. We have not actually literally met Jesus on earth. We've never seen him with our very own eyes. Remember that Peter is writing to a bunch of Christians who are spread all over the place, and the majority of them probably have never seen Jesus, probably never seen him during his earthly ministry. And so it's exceptional because since we haven't ever actually seen Jesus, we do love him, continuously love him. And this comes from the word agape, or agapao is the verbal form here. And many of you are probably familiar with this word agape. It means like an unconditional love. There's different words for love in Greek. One of those is like philo, which is like a brotherly love. Phileo would be the verb. And then the other one, and there are more than this, but the other one is eros. which is like a romantic or erotic type of love. And so this is God's, typically in reference to God, his faithful, loyal love in spite of us. In the Old Testament, that's the Hebrew word chesed, his loyal love, his faithful, loyal love for us. And here, this is in reference to Christians. Not God's love for us, but Christians' love for Jesus, this unconditional love toward Jesus Christ. That is a result, an exceptional result, because we've never seen him, but we constantly, continuous action, we constantly love him. Here's that second parallel, and though you do not see him now. Now, it's a little bit different, this second parallel, because even though it uses the same Greek word, horao again, it's different because now he's using it in a figurative sense. The first is literal. We have not seen him up to this point. The second is figurative because he's not talking about seeing Jesus standing in front of you or seeing him with your eyes. He's actually talking about not seeing him in your circumstances. And we can tell that because of this word here, RT, which means now. This is a adverb. And that's saying that right now, and of course we know the now is speaking of the trials that Christians are going through. Right here, presently, right now, you don't see Jesus during your trials. And we are familiar with this type of figure of speech because we think in terms of God being present during our trials. And sometimes Christians doubt whether or not Jesus or God is actually present. And they cry out, God, where are you? Why aren't you revealing yourself to me? Why don't you show yourself to me during these trials? And we might feel like he's not present. And that's the idea here. Figuratively, it seems as if he's not here during our trials. He's not making an appearance. It might even have a relationship to the rapture, the hope of seeing Jesus face to face, is saying, where are you? Why aren't you appearing and rescuing us during this time? But I think that it's more figurative than anything, at least it seems. So even though we do not see him now, presently during these circumstances, here's a second exceptional response. We constantly and continue to believe in him. Now, I'm reading out of the NASB here, and it translates this, what's called an adversative conjunction. It translates this adversative conjunction just very flat, very inflexible, just as but, just a simple contrast. But there's so much more happening with this word than a simple contrast between two ideas. What he's doing, and this is the reason that I've really enjoyed reading through the NRSV, is that it has a lot more flexibility. What he's doing, though, is saying that despite the fact, it's still adversative, but it has a lot more flavor to it, despite the fact that you have not seen him in your circumstances, you are constantly believing in him. And so the NRSV, as you see highlighted over here, says, and even though you do not see him now, and that even though is how this adversative is being translated, that word even. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. Versus the NASB, and though you do not see him now, it seems to be the same, but if you put this adversative conjunction right before believe, then you just have a simple contrast, but it's much more than that. So despite the fact that we don't see him in our present circumstances, we constantly believe in him. In spite of the fact that we have not met him personally, we constantly love him. Two exceptional responses. And then finally we have this, you greatly rejoice, we might even say, and you greatly rejoice, with joy inexpressible and full of glory. Let's read what the NRSV says here. You believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. So the way that the NRSV is translating this is saying these two words here, inexpressible, go ahead and highlight that with green, expressible and full of glory are both acting as adjectives. One actually is an adjective, the other one is a participle, but simple adjectives to this word right here, joy. And that's mostly correct, that these two are just modifying this one word, joy. But there's a lot more going on here than at first meets the eye. And I like to call this a snowball effect. You start out with something small, and that's this word here. That's this Greek word here for rejoice, agaliaste. We take this word and we start out small and we start to roll it down a hill. And as it rolls, it starts to gain momentum and it starts to gain size until finally, after going through these two words, we get this par excellence word right here. And it is the top of joy that you can get. It's the highest elevation that you can get to. And so it's explosive. And it's really it's kind of welling up into something, if I can say it that way. So snowballing, welling up, overflowing, and that's the idea here. You start with a simple word, and that's the word joy. So you rejoice with joy, literally is how it is. NASB, of course, is very literal, but sometimes it kind of misses thought for thought ideas. So you believe him and rejoice with, and of course the NRSV, in indescribable and glorious joy. And that's a pretty good translation, I think. But it's with joy that at first is inexpressible, meaning that you have a lack for words to be able to describe the joy that you have. You couldn't explain it to somebody. I just reminded of a music video, or at least an old song by the Newsboys that say that it's just a spirit thing. It's a holy nudge. It's like a circuit judge in the brain. It's there to guard your heart. It's a little hard to explain. And that kind of encapsulates, at least in musical way, how we can't always explain with words the joy that we have in Jesus during trials. It's hard to describe in words the joy that we have. I think of it as perseverance, and almost a numb perseverance. But once you reach the summit, you look back, and there is this exuberant, explosive, just praise of God, because you realize that you've really gone through things that no human being should have survived. No person should have been able to endure and to actually not just come out through it, not just survive, but to actually be improved by those trials, to be better through those and because of those trials. So that's kind of the idea that I think is going on here, is that we rejoice with this joy that you cannot describe. And finally, it's also a joy that is full of glory. A negative way of looking at this is when we think of anger. If you have anger that starts out low within yourself and it starts to well up inside you, and as things get worse and worse, the straw that breaks the camel's back, you explode because it's welling up and building up inside you. Well, this joy begins as something you can't express, you can't put into words. And then it ends up into an emotional, it overwhelms up and explodes into this emotional praise of God. And that's this word doxos, or didoxasmene, which is the word for glorying in something. And we don't use this term very often, I think, in circles like ours, about glorying in God. It is the epitome of worship. I think that's why he chose the word doxos here, because it is a worshipful response. And it is a worshipful response that we can't explain with words. And it's a worshipful response that is an emotional worship of God. And when we are caught up in true, unadulterated worship, we find that we have moved far from sin. We've moved far from ourselves, and we've moved close to God. And so those are three responses that Christians have during trials. And the odd thing about it, the paradoxical thing about this, is that the love that we have and the belief that we have and the rejoicing that we have are opposites of what you would expect a person to do when they're facing trials. You would expect people to actually cease loving Jesus during trials. You would expect them to cease believing in Jesus, and you would expect them to not rejoice in Jesus. That is why they're exceptional, because they're the opposite. And also, something that is very interesting is that all three of these are responses, but they're also the very products of trials. They're the very things that God is working to produce in us. And it's the very thing that will be produced in us. And God, again, always gets the glory.